You might ask yourself, where do all these alleles, all these variations come from? Well, of course, variations on the DNA come from mutations. Mutations are those random little changes in the letters of the DNA. Now, what causes mutations? Well, we already discussed that. Mutations can be caused either by exposure to nasty chemicals or exposure to radiation, such as sunlight, or also from just the cell making mistakes as it copies the DNA. Only mutations that occur inside an egg or a sperm cell can actually be passed on. So if you do get a mutation in a skin cell or a heart cell, that might affect you, but that's not a mutation that's going to become an allele that will be passed on to the next generation. Dominant and recessive alleles have different patterns of inheritance as they travel from one generation to the next. Dominant alleles tend to show up in every single generation within a family. Let's take this family as an example. Here we have an individual that has the dominant phenotype, which means that he has at least one dominant allele, and here we're shown that he only has one copy of that allele. Even though only one copy of the allele exists in the parental generation, half of the children are going to inherit that allele, and half of the children will have the dominant phenotype. So dominant traits tend to show up in every generation. They don't skip generations. Polydactyly is the formation of extra fingers and or toes. Now there are many different causes of polydactyly, but the most common forms are caused by a dominant allele. So this is a condition that can be inherited and can be passed down from one generation to the next, and it tends to not skip generations. So if it exists in a family, it tends to show up at least once in every generation. Here you can see some examples of polydactyly. Here we have a person that has an extra finger here. This is also shown in cats. Cats can have polydactyly, and you can see extra little toes on this kitty cat. And look at all these extra little toes that this person has. Now, polydactyly is also an interesting example of a dominant allele because it's not actually very common. I mean, how many people do you know that have extra fingers or extra toes? So I put this here to remind you that dominant alleles are not always common. They tend to show up when they are inherited, but they're not always the most common allele that exists. Polydactyly is also an important example of a dominant allele because it doesn't really affect the function of the individual that much. I mean, having an extra finger or some extra toes might affect how the hands and feet work a little bit, but it's not going to limit the lifespan of the person, and it's not going to necessarily affect whether they can have children or not. So a person with polydactyly is usually perfectly capable of passing that gene on to the next generation.
City couple is beaming tonight. They're the proud parents of a healthy but incredibly rare baby boy. See, he has 6 fully formed and functional fingers and toes on his hands and feet. His parents asked KTVU Health and Science editor John Fowler to tell their story. John?
You really need to see these pictures. It's called polydactyly, extra digits, not an uncommon genetic trait, but Bay Area doctors tell me so far they've never seen a case so dramatic. Born at San Francisco's St. Luke's Hospital 3 weeks ago, baby Kamani Hubbard seemed so perfect at birth, no one noticed.
Nurses and doctors, it looked so normal. They couldn't tell. They told me he was 6 pounds in good health, and that was all they said.
But his dad noticed this spectacularly rare case of polydactyly. 6 perfect fingers on each hand, 6 perfect toes on each foot. The general trait runs in his family.
Some family members have had the 6 fingers, but not completely developed, but not the toes.
In fact, Hubbard himself had nubs of 6th fingers removed as a child, as these non-functional digits routinely are. But this case, doctors say, is so vanishingly rare, so functional, it's not a deformity to be discarded.
It's merely an interesting and beautiful variation rather than a worrisome thing.
St. Luke's pediatrician Michael Treese.
I would be very tempted to leave those fingers in place. I realize that children will tease each other over the slightest things, and having extra digits on each hand is more than slight. But imagine what sort of a pianist a 12-fingered person would be. Imagine what sort of a flamenco guitarist. If nothing else, think of their typing skills.
Kamani's mother says she hasn't had time to absorb this yet. His specialness didn't even show up on prenatal ultrasounds.
I heard nothing until I gave birth, so I'm still in shock, kind of.
I just want him to just, see what greatness will be in store for him.
One current big league pitcher, a modern blues guitarist, and several remarkable figures in history have all had polydactyly. Now, this little guy may, at the very least, help others grasp the importance of embracing differences. Reporting live, Health and Science Editor John Fowler, KTVU Channel 2 News.
Progeria is another condition that is caused by the inheritance of a dominant allele. So individuals that are either homozygous dominant for this characteristic or heterozygous will have progeria. Progeria actually affects the cytoskeleton inside a cell. And so remember that the cytoskeleton helps give the cell shape, it helps move stuff around inside the cell, and it gives the nucleus its shape as well. Here we have a normal nucleus supported by normal cytoskeleton, and here we have the nucleus of someone that has progeria. And you can see that because the cytoskeleton is deformed, the nucleus is deformed, and that can drastically affect how a person performs transcription and translation. So people with progeria have a lot of difficulty in making and regulating proteins. And remember that proteins run the cell. They do all the important jobs inside the cell. So people with progeria have difficulty with cell division, with healing, things like that. And this can result in premature aging. Now, by premature aging, I don't mean you get a few wrinkles a little bit early. No, this shows up really early. Most individuals with progeria have symptoms by the age of 2. Things like hair loss, organ dysfunction, wrinkling of the skin, and so on. Now, unfortunately, most of these individuals don't live to reproductive age, so the oldest known cases of progeria died in their early 20s. So it's unlikely that someone with progeria would be able to pass this gene on to the next generation. So this is an interesting example of a dominant allele because although it can be passed from one generation to the next, it doesn't tend to be retained in families. It doesn't tend to travel through multiple generations. And that's because it's caused by a germline mutation. To remind you, a germline mutation is a random mutation that pops up in an egg or a sperm cell. While dominant alleles tend to show up in every generation of a family, recessive alleles are quite a bit sneakier. Recessive alleles can skip generations. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the recessive allele is only physically expressed in homozygotes. So that means that an individual has to inherit it from both parents in order for it to physically show up, in order for them to have that phenotype. Now, what if you're heterozygous for a trait? You have the dominant from one parent and the recessive from the other. Well, that would make you a carrier. That means that you carry the recessive gene, but it doesn't show up in you physically. However, because you carry that gene, you can pass it on to your children. Let's look at an example. Here we have a couple, and both of these individuals are carriers. They are heterozygotes for that trait. With 2 heterozygotes having children, the children have a 25% chance of being homozygous dominant, a 50% chance of being carriers themselves, and only a 25% chance of physically expressing that recessive. So because carriers are present, it means that neither of these parents showed the characteristic, but it can show up in their children. So it can skip generations. An interesting condition caused by a recessive characteristic is albinism. Individuals with albinism have difficulty making this pigment melanin. Melanin is the dark pigment that's produced by your skin. It builds up as you tan and makes your skin darker, and in general, the more melanin you have, the darker your skin tone tends to be. People with albinism don't produce melanin, And so the skin, hair, and even eyes can be very pale in color. Interestingly, individuals with albinism will have pink eyes, and that's because the front of the eye, the iris that normally has color in it and normally has melanin in it, has no pigment at all, and so the light shines through and bounces off the pink retina in the back. So you're actually seeing the retina on the back of the eye. Now, individuals with albinism have a lot of difficulty with sunlight because melanin protects you from sunlight. And they can have visual problems as well because they can't control the amount of light that's going into their eyes. Animals with albinism are most commonly seen in zoos, and you can probably guess the reason for that. Look at this rattlesnake. If this rattlesnake were crawling around outside in the leaves, it would be pretty easy pickings for a big bird. But you see these animals in zoos a lot because they're pretty easy to breed for, and they look interesting. They draw a lot of attention. All right, you guys, you're finished with this part of the chapter. Make sure you thoroughly complete your guided notes, and it's a pretty good idea to practice with some of these terms before you come to class too. Things like heterozygous, homozygous, dominant, recessive, phenotype, and genotype, because we're going to work with them a lot.